The cloud native applications we code these days have grown to encompass things much more than just the application code. They could be leveraging databases which are running in a cloud provider, or storage buckets, or messaging queues, and whatnot. Because of this, it is becoming important to be able to give your developers access to these resources during development as well. Because just think of it, if your application uses something like a messaging queue or a storage bucket, and you ask your developers to make a change on that service which interacts with that bucket, how can they test that change? How can they work on it if they don't have that feedback loop of being able to interact with that bucket, right? And because of this, it becomes essential to give access to these resources to your developers. But at the same time, you also need to make sure that you give this access in a way which is easy. They should not have to log into different cloud consoles and go through different dashboards to create things, or have to run and deal with DevOps tools like Terraform and whatnot. Instead, this should all be available as an abstraction to developers so that they can focus on what matters the most to them, which is being able to write application code, being able to ship value, being able to solve bugs for your customers. Apart from this, it is also becoming important to gather the information related to the different microservices related to the application in one place, because microservices-based applications are complex inherently because of their distributed nature. And that's why it becomes essential to aggregate all the information related to the application in different services and make them available to the developers in the right place. They should not have to run through different Confluence pages or other internal documentation to be able to figure out what's happening where. All the information related to a specific piece should live with that specific piece of microservice or that application, so that it's easier to navigate and onboard new developers to the project. In this video, I'm going to show you Okteto's external resources feature, which helps with these kinds of problems. If you would like to read more about this feature and the value it can add to your organization, I'll link some blogs down below where we have covered this extensively. In this video, however, we are going to focus on how you can configure and implement external resources for your own application and make the lives of your developers easy. Let's take the example of a simple to-do list application to understand things better. Now, let's say you have onboarded some new developers to work on this application and they launch a dev environment. This is what they currently see. Right now, they don't have much information about the application, what it does, how it fits in with our overall organization's application, or different configurational settings available to them. Now, this could be anything you want your developers to know related to that application. And we want to provide them this information in this one dashboard so that they don't have to go to the GitHub repository to read the README or somewhere else. So let's just say for simplicity's sake, our information is there in the README of this repository, but we want to display that here so that it's easier for developers and it saves them clicks. Now, if you're working on big applications with multiple microservices, these documentations could be living under layers of Confluence pages and can be so tough to find. That's where you'll really start to see the value in providing all this information directly on the Okteto dashboard. So let's head to our Okteto manifest and see how we can configure adding the docs for this repository on the Okteto dashboard only. We'll be adding our docs on the Okteto dashboard as an external resource. What external resources basically are things beyond your application's microservices, which are essential for the developers, and you want to make them available on the Okteto dashboard. So they are basically a link or a file or a resource which you want to point to from your dashboard. And to configure that, apart from the standard build, deploy, and dev sections, you need to add a section called external in your Okteto manifest. So let's do that first. Now I'm going to head to the documentation and see what values are available for me to configure here. If I go here in the docs, I see that I have a standard README section which I can use as a template for configuring my own docs. So let me just copy that and paste it on my UI and we'll see what settings to change. The first key in the external section is just the name of this external resource. And I don't want to call it README. I want to call it something more like docs for my application. So I'll just add docs here. And for the icon, I'll just go with Okteto because that's the company I'm working at. You could have your own company's logo or something else. And the notes section is basically what you want to be rendered as notes for that resource. In this case, we want to render the actual documentation as the notes. So we'll just point to the README of our own repository. And then you can add endpoints. These endpoints will link to something external, something which is living outside of your application dashboard. And in this case, we link to the actual README file in case someone wants to go there and suggest edits. So let me go back to my repository and copy the link for the README file, and I'll just paste that there instead of the URL for the other repository. Awesome. Now that you have this configured, all you need to do is run Okteto deploy, and that should take the changes in our latest Okteto manifest and apply them to our dashboard. Once the deployment is complete and you head to the dashboard, you'll see that apart from the 3 microservices which already existed, we now see an external resource called docs, which was the name we used when configuring this. Now if I click on that, I can see the documentation related to my application with all the specific things I wanted to include here. The other thing you'll notice is that apart from the standard endpoints for the front end and the back end, we have a third endpoint which points to the actual documentation itself. And we click on that, we go to the GitHub page where the documentation is. I just did this because I want to offer the flexibility to the developers on my team to be able to, suggest changes to this page by just editing this file. And that's why I added it here. Otherwise, it would have been totally fine to just reference that page as an external resource without an endpoint and have it here for the developers. Now that was a very simple example, but external resources, like I said at the start, are not just limited to documentation or simple things like that. You can give access to any resource provided by any cloud provider or any service provider for that matter to your developers and make it a part of your developers' dev environment via external resources. Now let's look at a different version of this to-do list application, one which allows us to back up the to-dos in an S3 bucket. Let me add a to-do here called try Okteto, and I'll click the save button to back this up. So you'll see that my to-dos are now backed up, and this backup is taken in an S3 bucket. I want the developers on my team to have access to an actual S3 bucket so that they are able to write code which interacts with this bucket and test their changes. Because if I do not provide this access, how else are they supposed to develop this application when they don't have the necessary resources? So that's why I configured an S3 bucket to be made a part of my environment as an external resource. So you'll see I have the link for the bucket which was provisioned as part of this environment, and I'll click there and I'll be taken to the AWS console where we can see our to-dos have been backed up as a JSON file. So if you remember in the previous case, our documentation was in hard-coded URL, so we could just simply put that in the external section. But in this case, this bucket, this resource is meant to be ephemeral. It's supposed to be created and deleted as part of the lifecycle for the dev environment, and its URL is also dynamic. So how do we configure this? Let me take you back to our updated Okteto manifest and show you how this was done. So if you see here, we still have an external section where my resource is called S3, and I have the AWS icon, and I have specified some notes which basically tell the developers what this bucket does. But in the endpoint section, I do not have a URL like I did in the previous example. Instead of that, Okteto allows you to set a special environment variable during the deploy phase, which references this S3 bucket and its endpoint. And once you populate that variable, that will show up as the URL on your dashboard. So in this case, if I scroll up, you'll see that here I'm populating this variable called Okteto external S3 endpoint bucket URL. Now the name of this variable is generated by combining the words Okteto external with the name of the external resource, which if you'll see is S3, with the word endpoint and the name of the endpoint followed by the URL. The name of the endpoint in our case is bucket, and that's why I have the word bucket here. Once you set this variable, it is also important to export this to another variable called Okteto-env. Okteto-env is a special variable which persists all your variables across your different deploy commands and sections of the Okteto manifest. Since we exported this variable to the Okteto-env, it is now available for our external section to consume and show the URL on the dashboard. And to create the actual bucket, all I've done is simply run a Terraform script which creates a bucket in AWS. And the best part about this is that you can already leverage your pre-existing scripts which you use to create things in production and use them here as well, because essentially you're creating the same resources, and all you have to do is once your resource is created, get the URL and just export it to the Okteto-env variable. And this was it. It is this simple, making any resource which your developers need part of their dev environments with the help of Okteto. What this feature essentially does is it abstracts away the complexities of developers having to manually go and create these things which they need during development, while at the same time providing platform engineers with the control and governance they need over the resources. When you use external resources, you ensure that whatever resources your developers create are spun up with the right labels, right policies in the right region, and are compliant with whatever policies your organization or your company has set. So go out and try external resources for yourself. If you want to get started with Okteto, you can sign up for a free 30-day trial by going to our website okteto.com. I'll link both the sample apps I used in this video in the description, so you can just try deploying those applications and playing with the external section on your own. If at any point you feel stuck, please do not hesitate to reach out to us via the YouTube comments or on our community website, community.okteto.com. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.